Spoilers and offensive content to come.
Na 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 na. This whole podcast is just us humming Zelda themes. Folks, my name is Carlos.
This is Dave.
This is Two Fat Guys Talk episode, I don't remember the number, and today we're going to talk about The Legend of Zelda. Now, Dave and I did just escape the Gerudo prison island, and we are on a fan boat headed out into the inky black ocean. Now, you might hear that fan in the background as we record. It's a miracle that we're getting any kind of clarity at all, so you're going to have to forgive that, but we are getting away. We do have hordes of shark raptors chasing us in the water. We can't slow down. We simply can't.
Don't forget the hurricane winds that we're trying to get away from.
We're trying to get away from the hurricane winds. Dave is, in addition to us talking about this, Dave is manning the map, and I am, I'm rowing in addition to the fan. I don't know if that's helping.
Well,
I don't imagine
you
it
are
could
the
be.
boat right now that we're on, so...
Oh, you mean like in Hunter x Hunter, that one old woman who can turn into a bicycle? I turned into the boat?
I was thinking more that you're the dragon boat.
I'm the dragon boat, so you are riding my... Are you riding my ass or my cock?
Sure.
Okay. So, as we do that, we decided, you know what, this is as good a time as any to discuss a series that has impacted both of us in a myriad of ways. Not only us, but the whole world has affected a lot of video games, past, present, and future. The Legend of Zelda. Devaniel, my first Zelda game was Zelda 2, and your first was Zelda 1. So why don't you lead us off here?
Zelda, well, I mean, NES, classic game. It was one of the first golden carts when it came to the old NES system.
A disc game in Japan, part of the Famicom disc system.
Yep.
And the Famicom disc system became completely obsolete on release as cartridges became able to completely replicate it.
I don't think it's fair to say that it was obsolete simply because, remember, with Zelda 1, they got additional modes that we never did because they could update. We couldn't.
Yeah, they got that the extra quests from their
Yes.
Satellaview or whatever system they had.
So, I mean, it wasn't obsolete by any means of the imagination. It just was superseded very quickly.
Those floppies, as cool as they look, though, only the later ones had shields.
Yes.
Like 3.5-inch floppies. So those floppies are notorious for failure and dust, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, there were obviously going to be hardware problems when you're dealing with
like
unshielded magnetic stars.
Like with cartridges, you can clean the contacts.
Yep.
You can bust it open and wipe away corrosion. In a pinch, you could solder in new traces if a trace has been killed. So
Yep.
the resiliency of the cartridge is definitely better there than
Absolutely.
Famicom disc games, which are all losing their magnetization and dying due to the rigors of time.
Well, and that's a problem with being able to keep media over a long period of time. Not what we're going to get into, though.
No, not what we're going to get into for the last 2 minutes. My bad. Sorry for that tangent.
Oh, no. It's still important because that was the different standards at the time. I mean...
It also kind of exemplifies Zelda 1, because even though that was not my first Zelda, and actually not a game that I personally enjoy, because when I've tried to go back and play it, I haven't been able to find much enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that cannot be denied, and a big influence for modern Zelda games like Breath of the Wild, is that Zelda 1 really threw you to the wolves in a big wide world. It was maybe, assuming you didn't have the Nintendo Player's Guide, maybe the first example of an open world game, and it was so early in the NES.
I mean, you did get the map.
Yeah, you got a map. A game that I recently played through without any help from the internet and just drawing diagrams to solve Tunic is a game that was very heavily influenced by Zelda. And yeah, even Tunic gives you some clues, but it leaves you to figure out, where do I got a bomb? What is the map trying to tell me? What has the game moved me towards? And eventually figuring it out yourself to find the Triforce pieces and reach level 9 and defeat Ganon.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely... You had to work at a bunch of Zelda 1. It was not... They didn't just hold your hand for any of that, granted. I mean, hell, you could technically skip or miss the sword at
Yeah.
the very beginning.
Mhm.
They didn't even force that part of it. So Zelda 1 was an awesome game at the time. I mean, you got to go around stabbing things, you earned money, you explored, you found all those secrets. I mean, it was a neat game. I mean, the dungeons were interesting in how they were. Each dungeon's pattern was different. The different bosses, the different strategies.
The dungeons completely changed on the second quest as well.
The second quest changing. I mean, it was worthy of being the first golden cart when it came to the NES. I know Zelda 2 was your first Zelda, and you really liked it.
I still do.
To this day, I have not played through most of Zelda 2. It just was never a Zelda style that I enjoyed. It was not for me.
AVGN said it best in his Zelda 2 review, that when people told him that one of the criticisms levied against Zelda 2 is that it was different, he answered back, well, there were two games at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was one style and another. Just because the first style is the one that kind of dominated going forward doesn't mean that Zelda 2 is bad. Zelda, if nothing else, experiments, and Zelda 2 was an experiment.
Yep.
It added some RPG systems to it. Leveling,
Magic.
for example, magic spells instead of the tools you had. A very RPG-like world map with random encounters.
Yep.
The ones you resolved with a real-time combat system and platforming. And there was a lot of mechanical depth to its controls. It reminded me a lot of Castlevania.
Mm-hmm.
In Castlevania, one of the best parts of its simple but effective design is that whipping takes time, jumping doesn't. So you got to pick what's best. And in Zelda 2, your standing slash has wind up, your crouching slash doesn't. Your jump has a certain amount of air control, and there's a lot of mechanics to how you approach combat in that game. I think Zelda 2 was the one where it decided to be less exploration, because I finished Zelda 2 in like an hour and a half, and I could do faster than that if I wanted to.
Yep.
Speedrunners have taken way less time than me as well. So Zelda 2 decided it's going to be less about exploration and more about the combat. And I think later 3D Zeldas took both games into account. I think when you look at Ocarina of Time, we're looking at a game where they tried to translate Zelda 1 into 3D, but also add Zelda 2 expanded combat to it. And that kind of became the standard, with the gimmicks still grafting onto that skeleton.
Yeah, I mean, after Zelda 2, we got Link to the Past.
One of the best in the series, and by far, like, anyone who says that it's their favorite of the series, I will never fault them, because for the longest time, it was my favorite. Even beyond Zelda 2, which I still love to this day.
It's funny how Link to the Past went back to Zelda 1 style. Now, granted, Zelda 2 is seen as the black sheep of the games.
Kind of unfairly so.
It fairly or unfairly, depending on the person, really no other game has tried that style again.
In Zelda, no, they've borrowed elements from it.
Sure,
but
absolutely.
they've never, and that's what I'm missing. I still want to see a Zelda 2 sequel or remake. I would love that. Now, other series have borrowed from that idea.
Yes.
Like the Wonder Boy series, for example, which recently made a comeback lately with Monster Boy, and also with the Wonder Boy 3 remake. I say recently, these are 5-year-old like games now. We're getting old. But, man, these oceans are choppy today. But something Zelda 3, something A Link to the Past added, they took the Zelda 1 thing, but then they used the Super Nintendo to really give some cinematic oomph to it. The opening of Zelda 3, of A Link to the Past, is one of the most memorable things. Your uncle, like, you're being telepathically contacted by Zelda, your uncle leaves, tells you to stay put, you follow him out into the rain and the storm, and suddenly you're going through the castle and he plays that music. It's like bum 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 bum, and I'm like, holy shit! Like the Super Nintendo really had the audio to make this entire fucking scenario just feel so much grander than maybe it really was.
Well,
But then you got other flourishes, the Lost Woods and the fog lifting when you pull out the Master Sword. Going back to the Hyrule Tower, and it's playing that song from the beginning, but this time it's a much harder dungeon. The rainstorm in the swamp, the effect in Ganon's tower when you take all the crystals, Ganon flying from the background and crashing into the pyramid.
The depth.
The entire pyramid itself, the fight with Ganon where he goes invisible, and that music. That game has moments.
Oh,
and those are
absolutely.
the moments that I think people really got from A Link to the Past.
Well, and the one moment that will always stick with me in that game is when you get the Master Sword.
Yeah, man.
You've gotten all 3 of the pendants. You go into the Lost Woods, and of course, then you get the fog parting. You pull the sword. And they have repeated and tried to mimic that moment in almost every game since. But let's face it, that was the moment.
I pulled it out in Breath of the Wild, and I'm like, okay, this was epic. Still not as good as A Link to the Past.
And Breath of the Wild is probably the second best after Link to the Past as far as, feeling the emotion of that moment.
Yeah. And then you're contacted and Zelda's in trouble. You don't even get to rest.
Yeah.
You have to take your new Master Sword and go save the world. And fail.
Yeah.
And now you're in the Dark World.
I only got to play little bits and pieces of Zelda 3 until I finally got a Super NES late into its life cycle. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, it meant I got to play all the games right now for it, but still, just the emotion, even, after having played the opener at your place all those years earlier, and then playing it through on my own later, it all hits, even when it's fresh and new. It's such a good game that it's still amazing to me that it took so many years for them to go back and do a sequel to that one.
Yeah, The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. I told you we were going to jump around.
Yep.
That kind of supplanted A Link to the Past to me because I felt like it was a legit sequel and not only captured a lot of the moments, but had a lot of its own moments. The idea of Lorule, of the traitorous Princess Hilda, the painting mechanic, which actually worked really well on the 3DS.
Yes.
The boss fights in that game are incredible.
Yes.
They had a proper Dark World boss theme, which is something you were really missing in the original Link to the Past. The final boss is arguably more epic than with Ganon.
Yeah.
A Link Between Worlds might be the most underrated Zelda, probably because it came out on a portable system. I would love to see that come out on the Switch now.
Hey,
I would buy that in the heartbeat.
I mean, this is where Nintendo is kind of messing up when it comes to the Switch. Like, I know they're already looking to the next hotness when it comes to Nintendo systems. I feel they need to kind of stop, take a breath, and we should have Samus Returns on Switch. We should have. I'm just going to call it Link to the Past 2.
In Japan, I forget the subtitle of A Link to the Past in Japan, but A Link Between Worlds in Japan was just that subtitle with a 2 at the end, apparently.
Okay.
So it is A Link Between Worlds.
Between Worlds.
Yes.
These are easy sells bringing it to Switch.
I mean, they did something I never thought they were going to do. They released Metroid 5.
Yeah.
Like Metroid Dread happened and was amazing. Mm-hmm. The Switch, you don't need power. The Switch has proven you don't need power. Nintendo knows their way around the system. As long as they don't try to unnecessarily tax it, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, they will get goodness out of it. They get the right dev studios to go around that power, like Mercury Steam for Metroid and whoever the fuck did that Link's Awakening remake. Like, they can get something special there. Link's Awakening was the 4th Zelda game, and one that I imagine you missed for a long time.
Yes.
Now, a buddy lent me his Game Boy for a very, very, very long time. A very long time. Mm-hmm. Like years before I don't even know if I gave it back to him. I think I might still have it. So A Link Between Worlds became commonplace. I played it, Keeks has played it, Poe's played it. Shoutouts to Two Fat Guys Talking Friends. it's like they're like, okay, we can't possibly have cool moments like the Super Nintendo, right? No, fuck that. Beginning scene, Link is in a storm in the ocean, kind of like we are now, and he fucking crashes on an island.
Yep.
And there's a big mystery as to what's going on there. So he's going through dungeons, and by the time you beat the fourth boss says, if you keep going, everyone on this island is going to vanish, because you're in a dream of the windfish. We're trying to keep everyone alive. So that game, in addition to having cool dungeons that each had their own musical theme and cool extras and mechanics that were surprisingly really good for a Game Boy of all things, also had the same, like, some moments. In some ways, there are some people who call that game their favorite Zelda, and I completely buy it. I completely believe it.
Yeah, even with the remaster,
That kind of the Switch one, which it didn't capture me that much, but I was glad it happened.
I'm glad it happened. I like the cinematics a lot more, obviously. New tech.
Like actual videos.
Yeah.
The little anime cutscenes.
Here's the thing. I still haven't finished it. It doesn't interest me as much. It's based on a Zelda formula that I no longer look for.
Mm-hmm.
Or, for that fact, never really looked for it. There's just something about it that it's unique in the way it does things, and it's just not for me.
For sure. So, I guess I'll touch briefly on the other Game Boy ones then before we move on, since I don't think you played them. They came out a little bit later. They were both made by Capcom. The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons, they kind of had a Pokemon Link thing going, where there was a combined story. Whichever one you did first, you would discover that those villains were actually working for Ganon. And they were working for Ganon's minions, Twinrova. And so you got a password that let you actually, when you put it into the other game, and instead of the story beginning the way it does in the other game, it treats it as if you're now there after those events pursuing Twinrova.
Yeah.
And both of those games have a true final dungeon, depending on which game you did first, where you fight the real final boss. Now, yeah, it's kind of skeevy. You got to buy 2 games to get it.
Yeah.
But it was definitely a neat change to the Pokemon formula because both games were very different. Mm-hmm. Oracle of Seasons actually originally started as a Zelda 1 remake. So a lot of the dungeons in it were actually very familiar to Zelda 1 dungeons. The mechanic there was that you could change the season, and it would change aspects of the overworld map.
Yeah.
Oracle of Ages was much more story-driven. So they did the Pokemon formula, but they actually managed to give us 2 very different games that combined to make a very good whole. I actually think that both games are worth playing today. But what was your next Zelda after Zelda 3 that really got you?
Well, after Zelda 3, it would have been...
Was it Ocarina of Time?
Ocarina of Time. Funny thing is, I've never actually played Ocarina of Time on official hardware. Because that was back in the days that I was barely in high school when the N64 came out. No, PlayStation would have been high school. So
no, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's correct. I think in high school, 97.
Well, that would have been PlayStation 1, N64.
Wait, how old are we?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, maybe we're giving us too much away, but we were both born in 79.
Yes.
So that means in 99 we were 20. Final Fantasy VII came out in 97?
Yeah.
So when did the N64 come out? It was a little bit before Final Fantasy VII, right?
No, wait. No, 7 would have been earlier than that.
Because 7 was not a Gen 1 PlayStation 1 game. The reason I'm using Final Fantasy VII as a benchmark is because it was a late 90s thing, and that's the first thing I can think of.
Because...
Sonic Adventure 1 was in the 90s, I think. How wild is that?
Yeah.
Or was it? Am I crazy? Folks, am I wrong? Leave us a voicemail. Or comment, or... I don't know, send us a letter.
But either way, like the N64 didn't interest me as an actual gaming system. It had games I was interested in.
Yeah.
But I wasn't going to... I didn't like the controller. I didn't like a lot of things.
Controller sucked. Anyone who says the N64 controller was good is a psychopath. Saying it right now.
Yeah, pretty much.
You're psycho. You're crazy.
But that was the good old days of the Wild Wild West of emulation. And the N64 emulator could do Zelda just fine with one problem. You couldn't save. You could save state, and if you loaded a save state, you no longer had sound.
I was going to say that the N64, one of its big problems is in addition to having a shitty controller and a kind of a terrible kind of install base, there were some dynamite games for it.
There
Not
was
just Ocarina of Time, but also it had like Doom
Smash
64,
Brothers.
Smash Brothers, Mario 64, a whole bunch of really good Mischief Makers, Killer Instinct Gold. There were some bangers on that system. That said, yeah, I remember you played. What you did is, because you're a good boy, you bought a perfectly legal copy of Ocarina of Time, and you actually had that beside you as you were playing the emulated ROM as a reminder that you were a good boy and weren't breaking the law. And I remember that the emulator was impressive in some ways, but this was still the early days of emulation, and no matter how much more powerful your PC was than an N64, unless there was FPGA at the time, you weren't going to get full speed.
Well, and funny enough, while I'm not going to try and claim it ran at a buttery smooth 30 frames per second,
it kind of ran at a buttery smooth 9 frames per second.
No, and that's just it. That's kind of remembering other emulation problems, but the first one that came out for N64 had it nailed. If they had simply fixed the sound emulation problem when you had to load the save state, that would have been a perfect emulation there almost.
I mean, these days people emulate Switch all the time. Mm-hmm. So,
because I think it could hit 30 frames per second, but I think it probably dropped around 22 for a bunch of it. Still perfectly playable on a Gravis controller.
Now, Ocarina of Time, I didn't have an N64 either, but that same friend who lent me the Game Boy also lent me the N64 for like 5 months before he asked for it back. And I played some of Zelda of Ocarina of Time, and I gotta say, I wasn't enamored. I played a little bit of it, I beat a dungeon, and I was like, you know what, I don't care for this. I ended up playing other N64 games a lot more than Ocarina of Time.
I believe it.
And that actually carried through. Other than the Wind Waker, I haven't been too and Breath of the Wild. Most 3D Zeldas didn't do it for me. I didn't really like the movement. I didn't like the kind of punch-out combat system where you just wait and counter. It was only Wind Waker didn't really fix the combat for me, but I was too enamored by the narrative and the cool boss fights, so that carried me through that game.
Yes.
Whereas with Breath of the Wild, the combat system actually works much better in the context of the open world and the durability system and other things that make that work in that context. So that's why I liked it a lot better in Breath of the Wild. Now, you are not a fan of the second N64 one, although that is a fan favorite with an interesting Groundhog Day mechanic, The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask.
Majora's Mask can rot in the bowels of hell.
You have strong opinions. So circle the wagons and come back around for another pass. Unload on this game, Dave.
Well, I'll go back to Ocarina for a moment.
Yeah.
Ocarina, I mean, the opening screen with the music and, you're finally seeing Zelda. Well, you're seeing Zelda for the first time in a 3D setting. He's on the horse, riding into the field, and just how open it was. Just like, holy crap! They actually managed to transition to 3D, and this just looks amazing. There's
something Nintendo has to be credited for. Like or hate their 3D games, they really put a lot of thought before making something 3D.
Yes.
Like Mario, for example. They could have just released...
Continued.
They could have just released cash-in 3D Mario games.
Yep.
Instead, they really thought about how that would work, and they did the same with Zelda.
Well, and 3D was the N64's thing. Every game was going 3D and everything else, for better or for worse.
It pushed polygons. It had a lot of anti-aliasing.
Yep.
Arguably too much
anti-aliasing. In a lot of cases, yeah. But I mean, with Ocarina of Time starting off in Kokori Village.
Yeah, Kokori, I don't know the name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's as close as I can get to it.
The village of unattended children.
I mean, the way that they did it, where you're getting you're getting the fairy, the Deku tree is dying, and you have to go inside it. I mean, there were so many neat... when you ended up in the future and you were older, I mean, it hit so many neat things in the world. You know, you're being introduced to the Gorgons for the first time.
The Goroks.
The Goroks. And, I mean, Zelda, Sheik. I mean, there were so many neat things in Ocarina of Time that, I mean, again, I played 99% of that game with no sound, and I had no problem with that because I was having so much fun with it.
Even though it wasn't for me, I completely understand why it captured so many people. This was a killer app for that system.
Yeah.
It was the game that made people go, I'm sorry, we needed a CD drive, why? And I'll answer that question for you so that there could have been voice acting it.
Well, voice acting and a lot more.
And then Resident Evil 2 comes out on the N64 with fully voiced FMVs. So what's that about? But
good compression.
Great compression. And nowadays, of course, optical media pales in comparison to solid state.
Yep.
So game cards of today, cartridges won, basically.
Well, the hard drive is one, technically.
Yeah, I guess so. That's why you can have versions of these consoles that don't even have a drive.
Exactly.
Fuck my PC, the next one I'm building, I'm not going to have an internal disk drive in it. If I want a CD drive, I'll get a USB one.
That's what most of us have done.
Now,
so then we end up at Majora's Mask. Now,
you're not a fan of this. I wasn't even that big a fan of it either, but I do appreciate the ambition here. I think a lot of people who like it because it had the balls to try this gameplay style, and because everyone wants to be fucked by the double helix sword wielding fierce deity Link. I know I did.
I never played Majora's Mask for N64. I didn't play it emulated either.
DS?
I played it on DS.
3DS,
yes.
Yeah, there was an enhanced remake of that and Ocarina on 3DS.
And even that, I was not a fan, mainly because I was already past my enthusiasm for games that put arbitrary time limits on things.
Now, you didn't really like that in Breath of Fire 5 either. Or in the Dead Rising games, which were kind of based off that.
Funny enough, the Dead Rising games were where I fell in love with the mechanic and then fell immediately out of the mechanic.
You know, the Breath of Fire 5 is where they got that inspiration from. I think one of the game directors was the same as well.
Yeah.
So there's that link between weird fantasy and real-world zombies.
I appreciate what they're trying to do. I really do. I just don't feel that it respects my time.
That's fair. I don't think every game needs to when they're trying to do a certain thing. Like, part of gaming is that you're plugging into its vision. Mm-hmm. But I appreciate that that's not going to be what people want. I mean,
yeah,
there are loads of entries in series that aren't my favorite either. So
the whole mask mechanic was neat, but I didn't care. The moon coming down and killing society was a neat mechanic, don't get me wrong, but yeah, as far as Zelda games, that was probably my least enthusiastic game that I've played.
But a lot of people love it, and if you're one of them, by all means, tell us your memories in the comments or voicemail. What came after Majora's Mask? That was GameCube, right?
That would have been GameCube.
Then we saw an E3, which showed like an adult Link fighting Ganon. We were all enamored by this.
Yep.
And then the next time we saw that, it was little Cat Eye Link, and people were like, "Why does Link look stupid now?" And then Wind Waker came out, and I love this game. I still have my same reservations with the 3D and the combat, but the art style, the story of it, the play between Link and Tetra, the flooded world, the fact that it was one of the timeline branches off of Ocarina of Time,
yeah,
and the final boss.
Oh my god!
One of the most incredible final bosses in a video game. You fight that puppet, and you're like, I hope this isn't the final boss. You climb the tower, and as the ocean suspended above you is collapsing, you and Zelda have to fight a dual-wielding Ganondorf who keeps blocking your shit, so you have to deflect the arrows as the ocean is falling.
Yeah.
It is such a fucking amazing battle. That fight alone makes the shitty Triforce hunt worth it. The
Yeah.
silver arrows being like a nuke makes the shitty Triforce Hunt worth it. That game had a lot of problems.
Oh,
but
yeah,
goddamn, did the highs ever make up for it.
The traversing the world and everything else was a slog. They fixed that in the Wii U remaster of the game to a certain extent, but there's only so much you can fix that sort of thing. But you're right. The highlight moments of that game were just like, a lot of us didn't figure out that Tetra was Zelda until it was revealed.
I had a feeling.
Well, you kind of be like, okay, well, she's our Zelda analog, but to actually just come out and say, it's Zelda. It's not, a descendant or anything else. This is Zelda, and she's been protected. It's like, neat. And yeah, that final boss battle actually having to work with Zelda to take out Ganon, and that set was just like, oh my god.
One of the things that really got me about that was the first time I thought, hey, this combat system, maybe there's not a problem here. Maybe it's the fights, because you had to fight Ganondorf. There was no wait for him to attack, because if you did that, he would shred you. You have to fight back. Like, you have to rumble with him, right? Or he's good, or you're gonna die. I didn't mind exploring too much. I did mind the Triforce Hunt. I remember I put down the game for a long time before I came back to it months later, finished it, and I was like, holy shit, am I glad I ever did that.
Yes.
But, what can I say? The highs of that game were so high, so I didn't care that the lows were pretty low. That game and Oracle of Ages and Seasons, I think, came out around the same time. And I remember all three of them did something that would become a feature later, and that's the Super Dungeon. The Savage Labyrinth in Wind Waker and the Hero's Tomb, which had two different versions depending on which Oracle game you played second. And I remember in Wind Waker, I actually defeated all the floors in the Savage Labyrinth and got the Piece of Heart, which was the reward at the very bottom. And I remember thinking, that's it?
Yep.
You just gave me a piece of heart? Not even a full container?
Completionist sort of goal, yeah.
Goddamn, that game did it. I wasn't as big a fan of its DS sequels. The Phantom Hourglass cramped my hands, and I didn't really care. You had to go back to the same central dungeon to unlock more of it and then leave. And then Spirit Tracks, I didn't actually play, but I heard it was another stylus-heavy game, and I'm like, I'm sorry, my hand cannot handle this.
No, I played that a little bit, and I lasted maybe an hour. I'm like, no, I'm done.
The first time a DS Zelda really got me was A Link Between Worlds, but I've already talked about that.
Yep.
Now, oh man, what's next?
Twilight Princess.
Now, I remember this was delayed so that it could be a Wii launch title, but a GameCube version did eventually come out. And when I played that version, because that's the one I was waiting for, because the motion controls in me, I don't believe in it for most games. The Mario Galaxies and the non-existent Kid Icarus Uprising, which should have been a Wii game and not a DS game, are the only games I would ever justify that. Maybe the WarioWare one was pretty cool too, but that's it. Twilight Princess, I had the same problem as Ocarina of Time. I got a little bit into it, and I'm like, I don't really care. But I know why people do, because the story's neat. I've seen videos of it. Midna's cool. The Dark World's kind of neat. The Warrior Zelda, I think this is the first time we had a Warrior Zelda as a character.
Chic.
Okay, this is the first time we had a Warrior Zelda who wasn't chic. The Zelda in the dress will be like, I will slash you with my sword. Like,
the fact that they went into a more, at the time, they were kind of making it like a more adult Zelda. It was a more realistic looking Zelda. It worked. I mean, I thought turning into the wolf was going to be a gimmick, but they made it work for the storyline that they were doing, and for the segments you need to do it with. I played right through and finished that game, and in fact, I remember, because back then I would always buy the guide with the game.
Yeah.
And you had
games.
You had to make sure you got the right guide, because they had to make two different versions of the guide, because the GameCube or the Wii version was actually flipped.
Because most people are right-handed and they didn't have a left-handed version.
Yep.
Shoutouts to our Southpaw gamers. Everyone should be making controllers for you.
Yeah. The motion controls were the worst part of the game. when they brought out the remaster of it, playing on a controller was so much better. But remasters are a whole different problem when it comes to Zelda games. But Twilight Princess, I mean, it had a more mature theme to it, or at least that's what they were going for. And, I mean, let's face it, that Twilight Princess was the first Zelda game that Zelda wasn't intended as your love interest.
No, I think it was that girl back at the farm. Or Midna. I would have picked Midna.
Both of them, actually.
I think Midna's hot no matter what form she's in.
You started that game, you already had a girl. And they were kidnapped. And other members of your town were kidnapped. You know, Zelda wasn't your whole goal from the get-go. Just actually like Wind Waker. Wind Waker, your sister was kidnapped. Like, focusing on something other than Zelda being the trophy at the end, I mean, it was something new that they were doing in that era.
Now, there are some Zelda games where Zelda wasn't even in it. She wasn't in Wind Waker. She wasn't in...
Tetra?
Sorry, when I said Wind Waker, I meant to say Link's Awakening. She was not in Link's Awakening. She was not in Majora's Mask, except in one flashback.
But that was such a refreshing change in those games. Yes, the motion controls were gimpy in that game. It wasn't... I remember being more happy with them than I was later. And then we end up with Skyward Sword.
Now, Skyward Sword was designed from the ground up for motion controls. They weren't just put in. Even then, when I tried it, I was like, "This not only is this not for me, other than Groose, I don't care for any of these people." Maybe my least favorite incarnation of Link, Zelda, or anybody. Demise is no Ganondorf. The only cool part about Skyward Sword was the Groose. So, you played it a lot.
I played it about halfway to two-thirds through. I've never finished it. I know how it ends and everything else, but Skyward Sword... I mean, number one, the gimmick to that one was that, ooh, look, here's a brand new Wiimote that's more accurate, and now you're going to have to, do parries and everything else.
Yeah, wasn't there an add-on for the Wii Remote?
Yes.
Yeah, there was.
You either got the special edition of Skyward Sword that came with the golden Wiimote that had it built in, or you bought the plug-in to the end that made it more accurate, quote-unquote.
Gotcha.
Whereas most combats still basically ended up where you put the Wiimote in your hand, put your hand on your knee, and then just vibrated your knee up and down. And that was the combat. You won.
That's how I master... Okay, let's not go there.
Let's not go there. But Skyward Sword, I liked the graphical style of it. I liked the setting. I really did. You and Zelda were already a couple. And then... this being, at that time, the first game in the series.
The first game in the timeline.
In the timeline, yes. Sorry. Not series. But it being the first in the timeline, and everything just going to hell in a handbasket. I liked the setting and everything else. What the downside of that game is there weren't enough dungeons. You kept on going back to the same areas over and over again, and finding alternate paths as extra dungeons as you got the different tools as you would in Zelda games.
Yeah,
it just wasn't... It didn't look great.
If you're going to have a Zelda game with few dungeons, like Breath of the Wild, which really only has 5, kind of, then the whole world outside of it needs to be the centerpiece, right?
And, I mean, the flying around on your bird and everything else was neat. Finding... some of the special drop holes, you can go into different areas and everything else. That could also be neat. But, again, way too much focus on the Wiimote and Nunchuck and keeping things in the air and having to keep on moving. I appreciate they're trying to get people active and stuff like that, but that game really needed proper controller. But even if it had controller... a proper controller to it, the game wasn't great.
My problem with the Wii is that motion controls were a gimmick. The Mario Galaxy games, the WarioWare, and the Kid Icarus Uprising we should have had for it are the only games I can say really warranted the Wii remote nunchuck combo. Everything else, it was just in there because they had to have motion controls for that system. I know the Wii is popular as hell. I hated it.
There were a few other games that were basically made perfectly for a Wiimote, and that was like some of the surgery games and stuff like that.
Sure.
Great, but
there was a Sin and Punishment game that I heard was really good, but I didn't play it.
But again, gimmicky as hell. The fact that they forced the controls on us instead of making it optional was the problem.
Yeah, Metroid Prime 3 and Trilogy did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Where, there was this novel control scheme, but there was no option for anything else.
Yes.
And I'm not a fan of that at all. The, what was the next Zelda game after that? I think in the main mothership one at this point was Breath of the Wild.
Breath of the Wild would have been next after Skyward Sword.
For Switch and Wii U. Now, Breath of the Wild, what can we say about it? Breath of the Wild basically looked at Zelda 1, and it looked at a bunch of Western open world games a lot of them were under the Bethesda moniker.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, let's kind of mix those together. Let's make a real vast open world where we encourage you to just walk in a direction and see what you find. There's something in most crevices and heights you can reach. Some treasure, reward, or view you can find. Some Lionel hiding in a corner of the world waiting to fuck your shit.
Truly.
Breath of the Wild is, in a way, it's kind of what Zelda was always meant to be.
Yeah.
It's this kind of formula, right? And I have no qualms in saying that's kind of become my favorite one, and I think a lot of people agree with that. It's... I played it late, and I played it in Master Mode, and I beat the Lionel on the Great Plateau before I left it, because I'm insane.
Yep.
But I really enjoyed playing it on that difficulty, too. I gave it a little bit of Dark Soulsiness, where I figure out an encounter, or I just die, as things do 4 or 5 hearts worth of damage. Figuring out the Lost Woods was fun. Finding the shrines is cool. Going through the beasts is interesting, because of the physics of the world, there's multiple ways to conquer it. Do you do it the intended path, or do you bullshit bouncing off a wall and ricochet up to a place you shouldn't be? Both are viable. We have new speedrunning strats and secrets being found to this day. Mm-hmm. And it's partly because of this robust engine of a world that Nintendo created. And Breath of the Wild, it's just an incredible game, top to bottom.
It is. I mean, ultimately, I truly believe that somebody at Nintendo played Skyrim and was caught up in the what's over there syndrome, went back and read some of the old Zelda comics, and then said, let's make our own. And Breath of the Wild truly is that. I mean, it captures a style much like how the old comics looked. Even the manual from Zelda 1,
in a way, it kind of was like Zelda 1, but fully realized in a modern system.
I own 2 copies of Breath of the Wild. I've got one for Wii U,
mm-hmm.
and I've got one for Switch.
Yep.
And the experience from both of them are actually quite different. Mainly because on the Wii U, all of the physics puzzles, you had to actually hold the damn Wii U controller clusterfuck.
They called it the Wii U control pad, I think.
Whatever. The clusterfuck.
The clusterfuck, yes.
And I remember...
I like my Wii U, to be honest.
Well, you know something? The Wii U only had so many good games for it.
And most of them are released on the Switch.
And most have come on the Switch. The ones that haven't are a shame and, again, a missed note by Nintendo. That aside, it was in the puzzles that the Wii U annoyed me. Because you had to use the Wii U controller. And unfortunately, there was slowdown in a bunch of areas. Like, I remember one of the puzzles on Breath of the Wild required you to, in the bird town, had this giant spire. And you had to time it so that its shadow went over one of the hidden temples to make it pop up. but you had to look at it at just the right time for it to do it and line it up. And there was frame rate issues on that because it was a giant shadow on the Wii U. Of course it's going to give it problems. Shadows are always a problem like that. And then when I played that section on the Switch, just how much smoother everything was. But, I mean, this game looked good on the Wii U. Looks amazing on the Switch. And, again, just shows that Nintendo knows what to do with its hardware.
They do.
It knows the tricks to make things look amazing. Because, I mean, you can see across the map in Breath of the Wild. Usually, draw distance is the thing. Now, you don't see it in high detail, unless you're playing on emulated on PC. But otherwise, I mean, Breath of the Wild was such a breath of fresh air. I remember firing it up, and my first encounter after coming out of the cave, I'm like, okay, let's do this. I've played 3D games before, 3D Zelda. Let's do this. Got my ass kicked. It was... My roommate was actually watching me play it, and he starts giggling, and I just start freaking out laughing. He's like, why are you laughing? You just got your ass kicked. I'm like, it's because I got my ass kicked for being too full of myself.
Yeah, even on the non-heroic difficulty that I'm playing, I'm playing it on the master difficulty, but even outside of that, yeah, the game will punish you for being an arrogant asshole. Yeah,
no, if you just rush in and think that you're all that, they have no problem putting you in your place. And I appreciate that from that game. The fact that weapons broke, I'm like, what the? Oh, this is what we're doing, eh? Okay, I can play your game.
Now, as of this recording, the as of yet officially unnamed Breath of the Wild sequel, which everyone has just taken to calling The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2, which is what I hope the title is we've seen a lot of tantalizing videos about this.
Yep.
It looks as if the open world is getting an entire... I thought in the next game they were going to add an underworld so that we could have dungeons, which is maybe the one thing I missed about...
Yes.
I missed in Breath of the Wild. But it seems instead they're looking to add that other dimension above you with Sky Islands and a big Sky World component.
From what I understand, though, we're getting all three. We're getting sky, land, and underground.
I haven't heard anything about underground myself, but I hope to see it. And we've gotten some interesting videos showing us some gameplay and some promises that we're getting more soon. I personally don't think we're going to see this game until late next year, but...
Yeah, I don't think quarter one of 2023 is a possibility at this point. I am fine with them delaying it as long as they don't try and delay it for the next console. Don't do that.
They might do that. Nintendo has done that already with 2 of their titles.
I know.
They did it with Twilight Princess. They did it with Breath of the Wild.
I don't want them to.
I hope they don't.
Well, no. We got on Wii U long before we got on Switch.
Not long before. Shortly before. Now, we can't talk about Zelda without talking about its various spin-offs, because there have been its mothership titles, but there have also been a lot of spin-offs. And while we're on the topic of Breath of the Wild, there is the Hyrule Warriors series, which is the Dynasty Warriors spin-off of Zelda. Now, I played a fair bit of the original Hyrule Warriors on Wii U. And there were versions of that game also on Switch and on DS. Very fun Dynasty Warriors type of game. My opinion of Dynasty Warriors is I'm not a big fan of the base Dynasty Warriors, but certain spin-offs like Dynasty Warriors Gundam, Dragon Quest Warriors, Hyrule Warriors, those are good. I really like those quite a bit.
That's where, honestly, the Dynasty Warriors, that's Koei Tecmo.
Yeah.
That is where, once they take their engine and basically get a license from another company, that is where they do good work.
Why haven't we seen a Final Fantasy Musou yet? That could be done really easy. But that's just a hypothetical. Perhaps we'll go back in time and put that into the last podcast.
Final Fantasy 15.
Yeah, no, there's no...
That's as close as you're getting to a Final Fantasy Musou.
What I mean is I want to see like Final Fantasy 6 characters and 8 characters be on the same team. I want a real Dynasty Warriors Gundam scenario here.
And that would be fine, but I mean, 15 already gives you a Dynasty Warriors a little bit combat with, having 15, 20 guys that can be on there that you're beating on.
I like beating on guys. Now, the thing about Hyrule Warriors is that there are actually 2 Hyrule Warriors games.
Yes.
One is Hyrule Warriors, which is the weird cross-time spin-off that had some original characters. It had multiple versions of Link. It had a story spanning timelines. But then there was the more grounded Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, which was based in the... it was a prequel to Breath of the Wild, but it also changes up the timeline a bit by branching it off, by having the characters warned about the calamity. And I guess, because I haven't beaten that game, in the ending they end up branching to a different timeline where it doesn't happen.
See, there's one thing I don't understand about what you just said and what a lot of people say. Prequel.
So here's the thing about the word prequel. A sequel is something that's the next entry in a series. And a sequel can actually take place canonically before. Like Devil May Cry 3, for example, or Better Call Saul. The word prequel just is a slang term for a sequel that takes place in the past.
I know, but it's not. This is what I don't fucking get about anybody who tries to say that. It's literally Link and Zelda after Breath of the Wild 1 is done, ending up in events that take place before it that could affect Breath of the Wild 2.
No, it's the Link and Zelda from back then.
No, it's not.
It totally is. You're wrong. It's the Link and Zelda from back then because they're also mingling with, like, the 4 heroes, the younger versions of people we see in Breath of the Wild. It's the same Link and Zelda. They get warned by that little robot from the future.
No. Okay. This is how this game goes.
Okay.
You have Link and Zelda literally exploring the ruins of fucking Hyrule. Okay?
Uh-huh.
They run into the robot. They then end up in the past.
What?
When...
Is that what happened in this
Yes! Game? Because their descendants are needed to help prove what happened to Hyrule so their ancestors who were in the fucking mechs in our dungeons no longer die. They borrow the powers of their descendants that we meet in Breath of the Wild 1 to then prove and help them not die. So now we create an alternate timeline that might be Breath of the Wild 2, that may not be. It's not a fucking prequel.
Well,
that is the... I don't get when people... Sorry. It's almost a trigger for me on this one, because...
There's no almost about it. You turned 50 different shades of red just now.
Yes. You're going back and redoing events that didn't even happen in Breath of the Wild 1, that had already happened. The champions borrow their descendants' powers, their own powers, to shield them against the parts of Ganon that were going to defeat them, and they beat them. So instead of Hyrule being destroyed, the end of Age of Calamity is that Ganon is defeated and Hyrule's not destroyed.
Weird. Maybe in Breath of the Wild 2 they're going to combine it. Maybe the Sky World is one of the timelines.
Well, here's the thing. This is why the trailers and everything else that we've seen for, I'm just going to call it Breath of the Wild 2, is so interesting with showing Ganon there and everything else, is that Ganon may not have been released in the timeline that we're in Breath of the Wild 2. This may, in fact, be a sequel to the timeline from Age of Calamity, which is why it's so important that it was a sequel, not a prequel. Because the way I see people who have watched the intro to that but haven't played the game is they think, like I think what you were thinking...
See, I think I'm going by what was in the demo.
Was that it was the Link and Zelda, while Zelda was still walking around trying to get her powers, and therefore it was 100 years earlier. No, this is the Link and Zelda that we're left with at the end of Breath of the Wild 1.
Well then, I'm going to have to play this game while I actually play it through. So, spin-offs. Now, the other
which
thing I
may
was
not
gonna
be a spin-off anymore, though.
The other thing I was going to say about that game is that game really taxed the Switch. If Breath of the Wild was a miracle of optimization, then Age of Calamity is either a miracle of unoptimization or we're seeing the Switch's upper limit.
I still believe that Nintendo let Age of Calamity... that Age of Calamity was planned as a Switch Pro.
It might be, and that the global shortage of components kind of
killed
fucked
that.
Nintendo over.
I truly believe that because Nintendo doesn't tend to create this amount of fuck up, and the slowdown in Age of Calamity, docked or undocked, is just, it's unfortunately unpatchable because they were planning on having more hardware, more power, and it just didn't come. So, truthfully, I think Nintendo for Age of Calamity, they should have bit the bullet and either done a PC release or done that as a multi-system release.
I've said it before, I wish Nintendo was just a third-party dev. But
Yeah.
Now, we could talk about spin-offs like Link's Crossbow Training and Four Swords Adventures, where you literally needed a GameCube and 4 Game Boys. But I'd rather finish off this episode talking about the spin-off that everyone and their mother hates and that they're wrong to hate. Because it is a definitive part of Zelda history that even Nintendo wants to scrub, but they shouldn't. Because,
I know where you're going.
And that's the collective American narrative works from the 80s and 90s. The cartoon that aired every Friday on the Super Mario Brothers Super Show. And also the Valiant Comics. Which kind of took that formula and made it a little more serious. And I guess by extension, the Captain N seasons that had Link and Zelda.
Yeah.
Because I believe it was the same voice actors playing those roles.
It was.
Now, Nintendo might want to scrub them. I unironically love that old cartoon. And I think the comics are very well done. And the seasons in Captain N that had Link and Zelda were very low budget and they weren't great. But even I have a soft spot for Captain N as a whole. And one of the reasons that I think Nintendo needs to acknowledge this is because it's an interesting take on Zelda, and one of the very first ones to offer us animated versions of the characters and actual orchestral pieces of the music. And
voices for Link.
Voices for Link and Zelda. They gave Link a personality because they didn't really know what personality he was going to have in the game. So they gave him one that was kind of a smarmy rogue, right? Which isn't entirely wrong. It's not entirely wrong. Link was a traveler in Zelda 1.
Yep.
They made Ganon kind of a pig demon mastermind, kind of typical of Saturday morning cartoons of the era. And that show actually has a lot of effort into it. There's a lot of work and some pretty good fight scenes and animation in some episodes. Other episodes had comedy that was actually really funny. The interaction between Link and Zelda is actually super good. And a lot of deeply over-serious turbo nerds hate this show, and I really don't see why. It is a part of Zelda history. I wish Nintendo included it in that big Zelda guideline timeline book they released, which is still really good, despite the exclusion of that.
I actually have the first one. It was worth buying.
Yeah, I have it too. And The Legend of Zelda, the cartoon, the Valiant comics, I think those are very much part of Zelda.
They are.
And that they should be celebrated, and that there should be a game made of that universe, even now.
It would be neat. I remember being more fond of the comic for that Zelda than I was with the show, but the show was fun. I mean, it's one of the few times I can remember a storyline where Link actually got the Triforce of Power.
Yeah, in the comic,
and it corrupted him.
He got corrupted. The finale of that whole comic series was that he had to fucking come to his senses. It was actually super neat.
That was an awesome way to do it. I had the anthologies that had the multiple. had the Mario, had the Zelda, Metroid, everything else. I mean, those were all good incarnations of the characters, and they should not abandon what they did.
I agree. Nintendo whitewashes a lot of their history, and I think this is a mistake because that is part of it, and there is good to be had there. I think that a lot of fandom sucks, and Nintendo fandom in particular, but if you ignore what the deeply over-serious Nintendo fanboys think, you look at these original Zelda American properties, and you have something good there.
You do.
You have something good. Now, the CDI games just are unsalvageable.
Oh,
but
I mean,
those are real. Those deserve the hate they get, and even then, Philips kind of got dicked over by Nintendo, so I have some sympathy. I think they're still part of Zelda. When you consider an entire game series, you got to take the good with the bad.
You do, even if you have to acknowledge that you never want to see it ever again.
I agree. Dave, what did you feel of our talk of Zelda?
Well, I think we have one more thing to talk about as far as Zelda games in general.
Go.
The music.
I mean, part of the reason I love the old cartoon is because it gave us the orchestral version of Zelda themes and the dungeon theme and other really cool themes in the episodes. And I think Zelda for music, CDI notwithstanding, has been just stellar. I can't think of a single Zelda game that I've played where the music was bad. And most of the time, there are bangers in these games.
Now, here's an interesting piece of trivia. Zelda music, as far as orchestral goes, is the first piece of music to ever be done as part of an orchestral work in public.
That's cool.
Because, I mean, we've gotten so many awesome tunes from Zelda. And, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I go and I see video games live whenever it's in town, is hearing orchestral versions of even music that didn't have orchestral versions are just awesome. Zelda music has always been fantastic. All the way from the chip tunes up to going full orchestra.
Yeah, I can't think of too many Zelda games that had music that I hated. Even back to Zelda 2, there were some bangers in that game.
Yeah.
In fact, the American version got the better tunes. The Famicom disc version actually has some songs that are less detailed.
Yeah.
Even though the Famicom disc system has an extra sound channel, which is a little weird.
That is weird.
Loads of memorable tunes. The Dark World theme is one of my personal favorites. Various dungeon themes throughout the years. Various boss themes. The Link Between Worlds, Dark World, or the Low Roll boss theme is an incredible bit of music. A lot of music in The Wind Waker is incredible. A lot of music in Majora's Mask is sufficiently creepy. A lot of music in Breath of the Wild is sufficiently filled with ambience and environmental influences.
Even as poor as the games are, I mean, Skyward Sword still has some kick-ass music to it. So does Twilight Princess. I mean, each game has amazing music that wasn't in the past ones. Mm-hmm. And even the remakes of certain tunes are just so good, even if maybe the game isn't that impressive.
Some of them are experimental and they end up working, like the Gerudo Valley theme.
Yes.
You took a desert theme and you're like, let's make a desert theme of this. Let's make it like some kind of like Latino cha-cha dancing romance theme. Like,
yep.
I'm like, that shouldn't have worked, but it completely does.
It does. Though, I mean, a tune I probably dislike in every Zelda game is usually the Water Temple. But the Water Temple usually sucks in every one of those games.
I'm trying to think of a Zelda game with a good water dungeon, and I can't think of one.
No, you won't.
Maybe the least annoying one is the one from A Link to the Past, partly because it's short and you get the hook shot, and that really just opens up the game.
Yeah.
But that's it.
And the 3D ones are just always the most annoying freaking dungeon. Every single one of them. There isn't a single good water dungeon.
They gotta do what Sonic did with their water levels. After Labyrinth Zone, most Sonic water levels, they're just like, let's make them fast. Well, that is The Legend of Zelda and how we feel about it. Folks, what do you think of The Legend of Zelda in general? Let us know your thoughts. Leave us a comment on YouTube. Leave us a voicemail on our site. And to let us know what you feel. Our site is animerave.xyz. This has been Carlos Dave Anime Rave. Dave, do you have any final thoughts to leave the people? And please tell them in the context of a Link or a Zelda.
Hey, listen! Also, fuck Nettie.